So that brings us actually to bank use cases. And I know we have quite a few bankers in the audience, so I wanted to cover this in a bit more detail. This is a survey from the Economist Intelligence Unit asking, over the next 5 years, where do you expect the most value to come from AI? And number two, fraud detection is a very obvious one. That's seeing a lot of use. We saw from the survey as well, a lot of your companies are using this. When you're looking at the first one, greater personalization and improved user experience, there's a lot that can be done there in terms of support. So companies have been more and less successful with using chatbots. Some have done it really well. Some have experimented with it and learned a lot. Some have not, but the digital assistants, chatbots, have a lot of potential for answering queries and very quickly getting users the documents information that they need. And if set up well, then they can identify when they're out of their depth and escalate to a human who can then assist with more complicated queries. Over time, they'll learn to do more and more complicated queries as well. Other things like actually tying into point 5, improving user experience through voice recognition banking. So Ty mentioned that he knows a local bank that authenticates you using your voice after a few minutes on the call. So no needing to answer a whole host of questions to prove that you're in fact the person that you say you are. It just uses your voice as a fingerprint and then says, yes, this voice pattern is almost certainly the person that we believe it to be. Digital marketing, so we touched on some applications of it in that domain already. Personalized offers, so the clustering systems comes in here. Applications and credit scoring definitely fall in here as well. Being able to figure out what would appeal to the customer and what makes sense for us to offer the customer as well. And these systems have a lot of power in that area. Better onboarding, so this is one of my favorite examples. A few years ago, we had the big Bitcoin boom, and suddenly all the Bitcoin exchanges were inundated with tons and tons of applications. Several times, so orders of magnitude more people signing up to their platform than they had ever experienced before. They had month-long backlogs and they couldn't deal with the onboarding. And many of them started applying a lot of digital onboarding and even AI in their onboarding. How you would use that? So you can imagine we have the computer vision side of things. We have the natural language processing side of things. So being able to read the person's application, but more importantly, using computer vision to look at the person's uploaded documents and determine, is this in fact a valid ID? Does this in fact match the person that has applied? Does the photo match a photo that the person has to take with his camera? And then you can very quickly verify and bring down that onboarding process, sometimes to minutes. That might have taken several people to go through lots of different checks. And I know there's a lot of this being done already with automated KYC, things like that, which don't necessarily require AI, but there are definitely some parts of that can be done much better with AI, especially the verification step. We have pricing optimization there, and that's learning about customer price sensitivity. When do you offer discounts? When you're interacting with sort of online services, online companies, you'll see that quite often when you don't want to buy or are not sure you want to buy, they'll automatically offer you a discount. And those things get better and better, and people try and game them sometimes, and then the system over time learns from that as well. But they will find out how to prod and nudge you to actually make that purchase decision. Back office automation, I don't need to go into. I think that's quite a common one, and something that's already being done a bit. Not necessarily everything with AI, some of it just with normal process automation. But if you're thinking about tasks that are being done over and over and simple decisions, quite often AI can just step in and take that off your plate. Regulatory compliance is something we had a query about as well, and probably one of the most underutilized areas of AI still. I think there is quite a lot being done, but there's definitely a lot more, because when it comes to regulation, there's basically a pattern that you need to conform to. And this is a lot of different AI approaches are really good at spotting patterns and spotting deviations from those patterns and finding the outliers. And so if an employee is attaching something which seems strange or saying something in their email which doesn't match what's normally being said, it can flag that as potentially leaking information or potentially being something inappropriate. When you're looking at making sure all the information is on a form and all the signatures are there and all the approvals are in place, fairly easy AI tasks, any sort of conforming to a pattern type of application. So we would expect that in the regulatory space, we are going to have a lot more AI coming in to help people comply. So we have the other side of this, which is the question on how to stay compliant with things like POPI, GDPR, as we implement AI. And I think it's very important to consider, you still need to be accountable to your customer for what you do with their data. And if you've gotten your customers' permission to use their data, to analyze it, to improve your business, to come up with the right offers for them, at the end of the day, AI is just doing the processes that you were doing to some extent anyway. It's very seldom that you'll have it doing something completely new. Rather, it's likely to do something you have already been doing, perhaps faster or better. And in those cases, if you adhere to the same data compliance that you have to adhere to under POPI, if you're using data for the same purposes, if you're using the AI internally rather than sending the information off to a different country to run through someone else's AI, generally that should be fine. Of course, having some legal compliance involved is always a good idea, and I have to disclaim that I'm not a legal expert. And then product design has some interesting cases as well, and we're getting better with AI producing content. So I've heard some AI generated music, which is fairly indistinguishable from jazz to my uneducated ear. I've had some AI generated Baroque music. I've seen some AI generated rap. I watched an AI generated short film recently. So there is a lot being done in that sense. In terms of actually designing brand new products, I think we're getting there. There's been AI generated recipes, etc. So I think in terms of looking at existing products, existing things, actually in drug discovery, it's being used quite a bit, and then coming up with something based on what it's seen that can be useful. AI is becoming quite powerful, and probably in the near future we'll start seeing it coming up with banking products as well. Although I haven't heard of an AI-generated banking product as yet, so this is probably more of an aspirational point.
Renier, we're having a couple of questions coming through on this point around compliance, ethics, security, and I'll just try and summarize the questions. Are there any AI and privacy issues that we need to consider? And what about cybersecurity? Can these systems be hacked? I find that an interesting question. Do we need to review our security and compliance processes or policies? So that was sort of on the compliance side, and then there are a couple of other questions, but maybe you just want to speak to that. You spoke about how you can use AI to we could leverage AI to ensure better regulatory compliance, but if you flip that question around, can it be is AI vulnerable to cybersecurity attacks and abuse and all those things?
I think it's safe to say that any digital system has some degree of vulnerability. With AI, there are some really weird ways that you can hack AI. It's quite hard to do if you don't have the system itself in front of you. But for instance, for object detection, you can start, if you actually have access to an object detection system, you could, for instance, I know a research group, I think from MIT did this, where they had an object detection system which could look at most objects. It would tell you that's a turtle, that's a person, that's a gun, that is a truck, that is, it could detect thousands and tens of thousands of objects very, very, very accurately. But then they reverse engineered the system, and they actually printed a wooden turtle, which they had determined would fool the system into thinking it was a gun. And you would have people walking around past the camera with this wooden turtle, and the system would alert that, hey, there's someone with a gun. And those hacks are incredibly hard to do, but it does illustrate that the systems aren't perfect, and they use some very complicated sets of patterns within those neural networks to make decisions. And if someone can get enough insight into your system, they could potentially reverse engineer a way to hack it. So I think an easy way around, well, at least a way to safeguard against this, is to have more than one system checking important information in different ways, because it's incredibly unlikely that a hack that works on the one system is going to work on the other. The other one is you still need some degree of human oversight. So you can think of this as something that makes us more reliable as people doing compliance, for instance, or as people making decisions in the business world. It supplements us, it allows us to more on a wider scale to do things faster, but it is still good to always keep in mind that the systems, like people, are fallible. And I've seen in businesses cases where, you know, there's a new employee that comes in that's really good at that earns a large degree of trust. People slack a little bit on the supervision, and then he makes a mistake that's actually quite costly that people didn't expect. And it's going to be the same thing with AI. If we get too comfortable, if we don't apply enough oversight, there is some risk that we might miss something.
I think you addressed most of it. Maybe one is around privacy issues. I mean, when I look at personalized offers and customer retention, I mean, you're really leveraging and utilizing a lot of private data for what is commercial gain. I mean, how do you see that?
Yeah, so I would say that is very similar to what a lot of the banks are doing already. I'm sure a lot of us have logged into a bank and found a personalized offer or a pre-approval for a loan of a certain size, for a home loan, which is generated based on our data. We're looking at our behavior, looking at our amount of available credit, at our income, at our disposable income, any other number of things which the bank has access to, which they're taking into account, to determine that they would like to offer us this customized deal of some sort. So in essence, that's something that could be quite valuable to the client in some cases if done well, but it's something that we're already doing as well. So we would essentially be using AI to do the same thing better. And I mean, some banks are using AI to do it already. And I think the key thing there is really, has the client given us permission to do this? If you don't have permission to do something manually, you definitely don't have permission to do it with AI. Would be a good rule of thumb, I'd say. There was a question actually today on ethical AI as well, and here it can become a bit grey, because over time these systems can become quite good at outthinking people. We've seen this with the adversarial networks, which is a very new area where an AI, Alphago, there's actually a movie about this as well, beat the world's top Go player. Now, Go is an incredibly complex game, far more complex than chess in terms of its option space. And it was really, really, really surprising when AI was able to beat Lee Sedol in Go. And that is by training against itself. And essentially, they call it an adversarial network because you have two networks trying to outwit each other. And if you have those networks doing that, they can do it millions and millions and millions of times, gaining experience far faster than we can as people. So actually something I should include in this presentation is computer-generated faces, where you have pictures of people, and I could show you 6 pictures of people and ask you which ones of these are fake. And you would have a very high chance of being wrong. Most people who ask that come up with the wrong answer, and because all the faces look perfectly convincing. And in fact, the correct answer is all those faces are fake, none of those people exist, and no one can believe it because they all look perfectly realistic. And so that's the type of thing where we can start misusing AI to manipulate people into making decisions that are not good for them. And I don't think we're that close to that being a regular occurrence, but on the darker side of things, that's where there needs to be some oversight. And yeah, as we get closer to this, there's more and more discussion on AI ethics, on removing bias from AI, because a more near-term problem is that if you train AI in the US, where the population is, say, predominantly certain groups of demographics, and the data is going to be mostly from certain demographics, then it's very likely you're going to introduce bias. And if you bring that model across to a different continent, a different culture, different backgrounds, the model might not perform as well as you expect, and it might actually be biased in unexpected ways. So there's a good way to deal with this, and that is to retrain or update your model locally and to test that it does in fact work for your local data set. Very important in medicine, where different populations might not respond the same way to medicine, for instance, as other populations. But for the most part, a lot of these issues are known, and we have ways to address them, or we are working on ways to address them. But I think having some knowledge, having someone look over the systems that is quite knowledgeable in AI becomes very useful for avoiding these pitfalls.